Hello, good morning. So, today we'll be starting with a revision class. The chapters which I would be covering is constructors and destructors, inheritance and pointers. Since all the three are very important chapters, even from the board point of view, that too, constructors and destructors and inheritance, you get 5 markers also. Pointers are also equally important. And since they are vast chapters, I will not be able to cover everything. So it's just a revision. I want you to study the book. And then if you have any doubts, you can go to either your campus teachers or you can watch the class videos which is there on the YouTube, wherein I have explained everything in detail. So 1 markers also you need to refer the textbook. I'm just taking very important concepts even from your board point of view. So we'll be starting with constructors and destructors. So what is a constructor? First thing is, see, I have told you I cannot initialize a variable in a class. Like if I say private int x is equal to 10, I cannot give an initial value over there. Why? Because it gives you an error. You cannot give an initial. Declaration and initialization is not possible in the private section of the class. All the initialization or dynamic memory allocation or everything happens in the constructor. So what is a constructor? A constructor is a special member function. What are member functions? The functions declared inside the class or a part of a class are called member functions. The class has data members and member functions in either public, private or protected section, whereas a constructor should always be declared in the public section of the class. You should not forget that. It's a very important point. A constructor should always be declared in the public section of the class. A constructor is a special member function used to initialize objects of its class, that is to give initial values. It is called automatically when an object is created. Whether you write it or not, whenever you create an object, a class can have more than one object. What is object? Object is an instance of a class. So to access the data of the class, you need to have objects created. Whenever an object is created to the class, the memory is allocated to the class. So whenever you create an object, a class can have 10 objects. So every time you create an object, the default constructor is automatically run. Getting it? The constructor is nothing but a special member function which has the same name as the class name. You can see here class name. So this is the name of the class, and even in the constructor name is also class name. Whatever case, whatever uppercase, lowercase, combination case, spelling, everything you need to make sure is same. Constructor is a function. Why is it a function? Because I have this open and close brackets. Otherwise, we don't write it for anything else. It is written for functions only. A constructor is a special member function which has the same name as the class name declared in the public section of the class, and it does not have any return type. That is, how do you write a function otherwise? Return type of the function, name of the function, and open and close brackets. If there are any arguments, you write it. But the constructor do not have any return type, not even void. You can declare it inside the class and you can write it outside, or you can declare and write it inside. It is up to you, but then they have to be written in or declared in the public section of the class only, and they have the same name as the class name, and it do not have any return type. And this one, you don't see any arguments here. In the class name, you don't see any arguments here. This constructor, that is a constructor without any arguments, is called the default constructor. A default constructor is a constructor without any arguments. So a constructor is automatically run whenever an object is created to the class. The next is Characteristics, or I can say rules of writing a constructor, which is a commonly asked, repeatedly asked question. This is like 90% of your PU board paper will have this question, that is rules of writing a constructor or characteristics of a constructor. These are the repeated questions, the 100% question I can say in your PU board paper. Most of the time you get this question. So a constructor has the same name. The name of the constructor is same as the name of the class. So the constructor has the same name as the class name. What is a constructor? It is a special member function of the class which has the same name as the class name. A constructor, even though it is a function. Yes, what is constructor? It is a function, but they do not have any return type. Otherwise, whenever I write a function, it is compulsory that the function should have a return type. If the function does not return value also, I specify it as void. Whereas if I don't specify anything, it takes it as int, right? If I don't specify anything for a function return type, the default return type is int. Otherwise, if the function is not returning anything, I need to specify it as void. But a constructor is the only special type of function which has a same name as a class name, but then it does not have any return type, not even void. The constructor should be declared in the public section of the class. It should be written in the public section of the class only, and a class can have more than one constructor. So you can have more than one constructor, but then there should be some difference over there. You cannot have default constructor more than one in a class. Like a constructor without parameters is called a default constructor, or arguments I can say is called a default constructor. You cannot have two default constructors, but you can have parameterized constructor and one default constructor. That is, a class can have more than one constructors, and all the constructors will have the same name, because whenever I say it's a constructor, it should have the same name as the class name. But then, so it gives rise to constructor overloading. If a class has more than one constructor, the constructor must have different parameter list. That is what I'm trying to tell you. Like for example, I have a constructor X is the name of the class and X is a constructor. So without arguments, it becomes a default constructor. I pass one argument and to the same another constructor I have with two arguments, or the data type is different. There should be some difference in the parameter list what you pass. So you can have parameterized constructors and default constructors. Parameterized constructors are those to which you are going to pass arguments when you create an object. How to pass? We will do that, because that is also a repeatedly asked question. And then a constructor without any arguments is called a default constructor. Every time you create an object, the default constructor is run. If we have more than one constructor, which constructor should be executed depends on the types of values passed to the class object when the object is created. You can pass it through implicit call and explicit call, and if there is only one argument, you can also pass it through equal to. So I will do that after this, but then whenever you have arguments, see, you don't have any arguments, it's a default constructor, so you don't have to pass anything. You just create an object, the default constructor would be executed. You don't call it object dot the constructor. The way you call the function, it is not like that. Constructors are not called using the dot operator. Whenever you create an object, the default constructor is run. Default constructor is one which do not take any arguments, whereas for a parameterized constructor, during the object creation, the number of parameters or the types of parameters you pass, that constructor gets executed. Please make a note of this question. Next is types of constructors. There are different types of constructors. Default constructors, that is constructors without any arguments. Parameterized constructors are those to which you pass parameters or arguments. Constructor with default arguments is, suppose I don't have a constructor to which I need to pass two arguments, but then I can set default values to that. If I don't pass one, it will take the default argument value. Next is copy constructors. Copy constructors are used when you want to create a replica of an existing object. That also I will do after this. We'll start with default constructors. Is a constructor without any arguments. The features of default: for every object created, this constructor is automatically called. Like every time I create an object, that is, if I don't pass any arguments to that along with the object creation, the default constructor would be automatically called. You don't have to call it explicitly. All objects are initialized to same set of values by a default constructor that is there. Like suppose if I say int x is equal to 10, I have a variable x and I am giving an initial value 10 to the variable in the constructor. I create 10 objects. For all the 10 objects, the initial value of the variable remains 10 only. That is, I have a constructor, default constructor, in that I have x is equal to 10. Okay. So, whenever I create an object, every time the value of x gets initialized to 10 only. I cannot give different values to x. Every time I create an object, for all the objects, the initial value of x remains 10. When the user class does not contain explicit constructor, that is, you don't have a parameterized constructor, then compiler automatically invokes the default constructor. Suppose if I have a parameterized constructor, that is a constructor with arguments. So depending on how many arguments or type of arguments I pass, that constructor gets invoked. If I don't pass any arguments, even though there is this one parameterized constructor, but I don't pass any arguments, then the default constructor gets invoked. The declaring a constructor with arguments hides the default constructor. That is, when I have a parameterized constructor and I am passing arguments, it hides the default constructor. Disadvantages of default constructors: when many objects of the same class are created, all objects are initialized to same set of values. That is, I told you, like x is equal to 10. If I give an initial value to a variable x as 10, I create 10 objects. For all the 10 objects, the value of x remains 10 in the beginning. It gets initialized. Suppose for one, I want to initialize the value of x as 5. To another one, I need to have 6. I cannot do that, right? It is not possible to initialize different objects with different initial values using default constructor. Using default constructor, I cannot give different initial values to the same variable using different objects. The next is default constructors. This is the general syntax of a default constructor. You have class and then you have a class name. Private section, you have data members. In the public section, yes, constructor has to be written in the public section only. Class name, the name of the class is class name, so I am giving here. There is no return type to the constructor, no arguments, but then it is a function, so you have to use open and close brackets. Inside that you can write any initialization statements. It is a default constructor because it does not have any arguments passed to it. Arguments here, and then it does not return any value. It has the same name as the class name and declared in the public section of the class. This is the general syntax of a default constructor. Please have a look. So this definitely many a times they ask to write what are default constructors and explain default constructors with a programming example. They don't ask you like write this example only or that, but then they can ask you to explain the concept using a programming example. So I have written one. What is a default constructor? The constructor without any arguments, which is invoked automatically whenever an object is created, is a default constructor. Constructor is nothing but a special member function which has the same name as the class name, which does not have any return type, not even void, declared in the public section of the class. That is a constructor. So now I will explain you this program of default constructors. You can make a note of this also, but then I will not be able to keep the PPT for a very longer time because I need to cover the other two chapters also, which are very big chapters in a 1 hour's time. Hash include iostream.h. This one class is the name of the class. Please write it in lowercase. The C is not in uppercase because class is a keyword. All the keywords are written in lowercase only. Number is the name of the class. So whatever case I declare, you can write it like all upper numbers are lower, or this thing are a combination case. I have class number. Number is the name of the class. In the private section, I have a variable called x. So class number, name of the class is number. In the private section, the data member which I have is x, which is of the type integer. Then in the public section, I have numbers. See, you can see here the spelling, the case, everything is same. The only thing is I have, since this is a member function, I have used open and close brackets. It is declared in the public section of the class. It does not have any return type and no arguments. So it is a default constructor. Inside that, I am writing cout in default constructor, right? Whenever this constructor gets executed, this statement would be printed because I have it in a cout statement. After that, I am giving an initial value to x as 500. So what is the value of x now? 500. X is declared as a class variable. Int x is a class variable which is declared in the private section of the class. Then I have in the public section a constructor wherein the first line of the constructor is in default constructor, and then I am giving an initial value to x as 100. After that, I have one more function in the class. So this function is not a constructor. That is why the return type, name of the function, argument list if any, displays the name of the function which does not return any value, and there are no arguments passed to it. That is what this means. Like void is nothing but the function does not return any value. Display is the name of the function, that is the member function, because it is declared in the class, and open and close brackets. I don't see any arguments. So a function without return, without arguments. In that, I am printing x. Please go through this once. So I'm just printing x. X gets printed as it is because it is in double quotes, and the value, what will it print here? Because in the constructor I have given an initial value as 100, and where am I printing this? I am printing the value of x in the display function. Since both belong to the same, value of x gets printed in the display function, and x is a class variable. After that, I have closed my class here. Don't forget to put a semicolon when you're terminating a class. Say display is declared and defined inside the class only. That is why display function is this. And then I am closing the class here, the class number. After that, void main. Yeah, every program should have a main. Clear screen. I'm putting a semicolon, so this becomes a new line. Number NOBJ. What happens? number nobj. I'm creating an object. How do I create an object? Class name space the object name. This is the syntax for creating objects, that is class name space the object name. Number nobj, that is the syntax of creating an object. Name of the object is nobj and it is the object of the class number. When I write this statement gets executed, the default constructor is invoked automatically. So when I create an object for the class, the default constructor gets executed. It will print me in default constructor because I have a cout statement there, and then x is equal to, I have put 500, that gets initialized, x value x gets initialized to 500. See here, I can see in the default I don't have a cout statement over there for x. I have only a cout statement for here, cout in the default constructor, and then I have x is equal to 500. I am giving an initial value to x as 500, and then in the display function I am printing the value of x. So when this statements get run, gets like when I create an object, the default constructor is run, only the statement in the default constructor is printed, and then the value x gets the variable x gets initialized to 500. And then I have calling the display function. How do I call a member function? The object name dot the function name. So when I call the display function, whatever is there in the display function gets executed, and I am printing x 500. So this is the program for default constructor. Next, I am going a little fast because there's a shortage of time. I'm not sure how much I'll be able to cover. Parameterized constructors, that is constructors with parameters, is called parameterized constructors. The parameterized constructor is nothing but constructor with arguments or parameters is called a parameterized constructor. Features of parameterized constructors: it is possible to initialize different objects with different values. In default, it was not possible. In parameterized, you can give different initial values with different objects. The parameterized constructor can be overloaded. What do you mean by overloading? Same name with different signatures is overloading. Here also I can have a default, one parameterized constructor with one argument, another with two. So like you can have number of arguments different or the data type of arguments different. So it can be overloaded. For an object created with one argument, constructor only with one argument is invoked. Like you create an object with one argument, that is you're passing only one argument, that gets invoked. And constructor can have default arguments and default values. So default arguments, you please go to the YouTube class and go through that, so you will know what is default arguments. This is a very important question even from the board point of view. Like the methods of calling parameterized constructors, they will ask you to name and they can say write an example for explicit call or implicit call, or they can say whichever one you explain. But then you have to write an example for that also. So the methods of calling a parameterized, default constructor, whenever you create an object it gets automatically run. You don't need methods for calling a default constructor. What is a default constructor? A constructor with no arguments is a default constructor, and whenever you create an object, a default constructor is run, so you don't have to have different methods. Whereas if you are having a parameterized constructor wherein you need to pass parameters during object creation, there are three types. One is explicit call, the other one is implicit call, and initialization at the time of declaration with equal to operator. But to use equal to, the constructor should have only one parameter. More than one parameter, if you need to pass, either you can use implicit call or explicit call. So this is a very important question. I have written a program to use parameterized constructor using both implicit call and explicit call in one program only. Please make a note because they'll ask you to write example. You can write this simple example program. To what am I doing in this program? I'm writing a program using parameterized constructors with implicit as well as explicit call. What is the program doing? It is finding the larger of two numbers. Like you're passing two numbers and then you need to find which one is the larger number and you need to print it. That is a program to find the largest of two numbers using parameterized constructors with implicit call and explicit call. Hash include iostream.h, hash include conivo.h. You have these two. Then class max. Max is a name of the class. Everything in uppercase I have written, so you need to maintain that case only throughout. Don't use lowercase, use uppercase. Class max. In the private section of the class, I have int big. Big is a data member which is of type integer declared in the private section of the class. So only the class members can access it, that is member functions of the class can access it. It is not accessible outside the class. In the public section, I have a parameterized constructor. How can I say this is a parameterized constructor? Because the function has the same name as the class name. Max was the class name and the function name is also same. It is declared in the public section of the class. It does not have any return type. There is no return type written over here. The name of the class is same as the function name, and it is not a default constructor because I am passing two arguments to it. That is int x and int y are the two arguments which I am going to pass. That is why it is having two parameters. That is why it is called as a parameterized constructor. Inside, what am I doing? If x is greater than y, big. I have declared big. You know that in the data member of the class, right? Big is the data member of the class which is going to store integer value. Same way I am having here x and y are integers. So definitely the output also will be a integer. So I am saying if x is greater than y, big is equal to x, else big is equal to y. Because since there are only two cases, it should be greater than y or less than y. So what happens if both are equal here? Both are equal also, it will go to the else part and make it as big is equal to y, because x is 10, y is 10. 10 is not greater than 10. So if is not true, it goes to the else part and big is equal to y. Finally, it will print me 10 because both are same. But then it will go to the else part and print y there rather than printing x, because 10 is not greater than 10. If x is one value and y is a different value, definitely easily you can compare it. If x is greater than y, big is equal to x, and else big is equal to y. After that, I am closing my constructor. Constructor is a function. Function need not be terminated. That is, functions are not terminated by a semicolon. Here I have void display. Display function, I am printing larger number and whatever is the result of this. So how many arguments are there? Two arguments has to be passed. Name of the class is same as the constructor name, since I'm passing two arguments, it is called the parameterized constructor. Fine. Have a look and please, hopefully, I've made a note of this along with me. Then what am I doing? I have to pass arguments. See, in main max m1, how do I create an object? Class name space the object name. That is how I create an object, and while creating object only, you pass arguments to the parameterized constructor. Max m1 10 comma 30. During object creation only, I am writing bracket here and I am passing 10 comma 30. Both are integers. X will take the value 10, y will take the value 30. That is called implicit call, because during the object creation only I'm just putting an argument, this thing, I'm passing the arguments. And then next is explicit call. Can I make use of this m1 only here? No, because here also I am creating an object max m2, because whenever you need to invoke a constructor, you cannot make use of the same object. So max m1, that is 10 comma 30, is the implicit call, and max m2 is equal to max, again the constructor of 67 comma 69 is explicit call. This is the explicit call. This way you will write the explicit, this way you will write the implicit call, and I am calling display function once with m1 and another time with m2. Please make a note of this now. Constructor overloading is having the same name with different function signatures. What is a copy constructor? If you want to create an object, that is to initialize an object with the values of already existing object. I have an object and I'm creating a new object, and I want the new object to have the values of the already existing objects. That time I make use of a copy constructor. When objects must be written to as function values, when a new object is declared and existing object is passed as a parameter to it in declaration, then copy constructor is invoked. That is, you use a copy constructor when you want to create an exact replica of an existing object. This is the copy constructor. Ampersand ptr is that object which you are passing as an argument to it. Next are destructors. Again, destructor is also a repeatedly asked question. Please make a note of this. What is a destructor? What is a constructor? So destructors are also repeatedly asked question. What is a destructor? It can be a 1 marker also, it can be a 5 marker also, right? A destructor is a function that also has the same name as the class name, need to be declared in the public section of the class, but which has a tilde sign, this sign before that. It also has the same name as the class name, no return type, but the difference between constructor and destructor is it has a tilde sign before that, and you cannot overload a destructor. That is, destructor does not take any arguments. That is why you cannot overload it, and one destructor is run for a object, like a function that automatically executes when an object is destroyed. When you destroy an object, every time you destroy an object, then the destructor is run. The destructor must have the same name as the class name preceded by the tilde. The destructor takes no arguments, so it cannot be overloaded. It does not have a return type. It can have only one destructor in a class, because I cannot have parameterized destructors. I cannot overload a destructor, so definitely I will have only one destructor in a class, and it should be declared in the public section of the class only. And destructor cannot be inherited. You cannot inherit. Inheritance means creating a class from an existing class. So when you create it, all except the private data members and member functions, all the data gets inherited, but A destructor has to be declared in the public section but cannot be inherited, and it is run in the end for each program. This is a program to illustrate destructors. Please make a note. What is the name of the class? The name of the class is number, right? And this one is a constructor or a destructor. It is a constructor because it is also having the same name as the class name declared in the public section of the class. Cout constructor. This would be printed as it is when an object is created. That is cout constructor. After that, I have a destructor. How do I know it is a destructor? Because I have a tilde sign declared in the public section of the class and it does not have any arguments. It cannot be overloaded. So I am just printing cout. Every time the destructor gets executed, I will write cout destructor. Here, cout constructor. After that, how many objects I am creating? I am creating two objects, n1 and n2. So you will have for n1 constructor would be run, it will print me constructor. For n2 also constructor would be run, which will print me n2. After that, the destructor, when I am going out of the application because there was nothing else to do, I have the destructors would be run and then destructor would be printed. So hopefully you have understood constructors and destructors. 1 markers, please ask your campus teachers, you can go through it. And then since we are shortage of time, I am rushing. I need to do still 2 more chapters. So now we will do the next chapter, that is inheritance. We finished constructors and destructor revision. See, I have taken only a few concepts, like you need to read your textbook, right? For 1 markers, you please go through the questions in your exercise. So inheritance, like what is inheritance? Inheritance is nothing but the ability of acquiring a properties of the base class from the derived class. That is nothing but you are creating a new class from an existing class is inheritance. That is creating something new from the existing. So wherein the new thing what you create would acquire the properties of the existing one. So a mechanism in which a new class gets created or derived from an existing class. So when you do that, when you create a class from an existing class, the derived class or the new class will acquire the properties of the existing class. That is what it means. So example is, see, you can see the parents, the child takes in the properties or inherits the properties. Parents are existing, you're creating something new. The child would acquire the properties of the parents as well as it will have its own properties. It is not completely a clone of parents, right? Some properties are from parents and it will have its own. So that is what it means. The derived class will acquire the properties of the base class and then it will have some properties of its own. So the definition of normally they'll ask you what is a base class and what is a derived class for a 1 marker question. A base class in OOPS, that is object oriented programming, is from which the other classes are derived. A class whose properties are inherited by another class or a class from which base class is nothing but a class from which another class is derived. It can be one class or multiple class. You can derive multiple classes from one class or you can derive one class from one class. So that is a class whose properties are inherited by another class is known as base class. Base class is also called as a superclass. Derived class is nothing but which inherits the properties from the base class because it is the newly created one. The class which you create from an existing class is nothing but the derived class, and the class from which the class is created is nothing but the base class. A derived class is a class created or derived from an existing class. It is also called as a subclass. So what are the advantages of inheritance? code reusability, faster development. Yeah, you are using, when you're creating something from the existing one, definitely you are reusing. You're not repeating the code. You're already, it is there. You're making use of it. Easy to maintain, easy to extend. And testing and debugging is easy because you have already tested and debugged it. So you don't have to do it again. Only you just have to acquire or create again from that. Then disadvantages, if you don't use it properly, you will get wrong solutions. And then memory wastage can also happen and it is more complicated. So you need a proper programmer to do that, and calling member function using objects causes computer overheads. Next, yeah, this is a normally asked question. What are the different types of inheritance or forms of inheritance? The different forms of inheritance are single inheritance, multi-level inheritance, multiple inheritance, hierarchical inheritance, and hybrid inheritance. They'll ask you most of the time, this question is asked, what are the different types of inheritance, and explain any one of them. They can ask you, or they can ask you just what are the different types. Depending on the marks, the question would be there. Like inheritance can be classified into 5 forms, that is single inheritance, multi-level inheritance, multiple inheritance, hierarchical, hybrid inheritance. These are the different types of inheritance. So what is a derived class? Just this is how I'm going to derive. The general syntax of inheritance is class is a keyword. Derived class name is any user defined name. You can give any name. Like for example, I have class A and I want to derive a class B from A. So what I will do? Class is the keyword. I will write it as it is. And what is the derived class name I want to derive? It is B. So I will say class B colon visibility mode is either private, public or protected. So I will say public here and then the base class name. So class derived class name. Derived class name is any user defined name. Colon, yes, it is the syntax. Class is the keyword. You have to write it. Derived class name is anything, any identifier name. You can give any name. Colon, it's again the syntax. It's not double, it's not scope resolution operator here I am using. You're only using colon. And then visibility mode. It can be either public, private or protected. If you don't specify anything, the default is private. If I don't specify any visibility mode, there are 3 visibility modes: private, public and protected. If I don't specify anything, then it is private. Otherwise, you have to specify explicitly which visibility mode you need, and then the base class name, that is from which you are creating a class. So base class should already be there. Otherwise, you cannot create this. And then how do I write the class? Private, public and protected. The same way we write classes, and the class has to be terminated by a semicolon. This is the general syntax of inheritance. Any type of inheritance, this is the syntax. The visibility mode. Again, this is also a very important question. What are visibility modes and how are they different? I'll tell you how are they different. Visibility modes can be public, private or protected. And one more thing, if you're not able to, like, this is a revision class. I have written one program for each invisibility mode. You please go to the class, inheritance class in YouTube, and you will understand it better. Visibility modes can be private, public or protected. There are 3 visibility modes. One is private, the other one is public, the other one is protected. The private data of the base class cannot be inherited. Like whatever is there, like in a class you will have private section wherein you have the data and member functions, then you have the public, and you also have protected. When I have inheritance, you have the access specifier protected also. whatever you write in the private section of the class, that is under the private access specifier, that cannot be inherited. You cannot inherit private data of the class. It is only for the class. The member functions of the class can only access that. It cannot be accessed outside, nor it can be inherited. You can inherit protected as well as public data, but you cannot inherit private data. Private data is always private to the class. That is the private data. The data declared in the private section or the under the private access specifier of the class cannot be inherited. This public members or members or member functions or data members of the base class will become public members of the derived class, and protected members of the base class becomes the protected members of the derived class. See, if the visibility mode is public, private data you cannot inherit. I will tell you, see here, you can, in this diagram you can see here, for example, you have a base class and public, you have under public you have some member functions and data members. Under protected also you have declared some functions and this thing. In private also you have declared. So that is the base class. When I inherit, when the visibility mode is public, like when I say visibility mode is public, what happens is the public data, whatever you have declared under the public data of the base class, becomes the public data under the public section of the derived class. It will be placed, you should know where it will be placed in the derived class also, right? When you are inheriting something, in which section of the derived class will it be placed? You should be very careful about that also. That is why I will have visibility modes. Depending on the visibility mode, the data of the base class would be placed in the corresponding section of the derived class. So if I say the access specific, if I say the visibility mode is public, when I say the visibility mode is public, then private data, whatever it is, whether it's public, private or protected access, it never gets inherited. So you don't have to worry about the private data, because you cannot inherit private data. Only the data present in the public as well as the protected access under the protected access specifiers can be inherited. So when I say the visibility mode is public, then all the data which is present under the public section goes to the public section of the derived class. Under protected, whatever I have declared will go to the protected section of the derived class. Getting it? So protected goes to protected, public goes to public, private does not get inherited if the visibility mode is public. Next, if the visibility mode is protected, what happens is private never gets inherited. Public also will go to the protected section of the derived class, and protected goes to the protected. If the visibility mode is protected, public also goes to the protected section of the derived class, and protected also goes to the protected section of the derived class, and private data never gets inherited. This is the, when you say visibility mode is protected. When I declare anything under protected, they cannot be accessed outside the class. It is similar to, they are private outside the class, but then they can be accessed by the derived class member functions, whereas private data cannot be accessed by even the derived class member functions. Protected data can get inherited. You can inherit protected data, and it is accessible to its own class members as well as the derived class members, whereas private data neither can be inherited nor it is accessible outside the class. So when I say protected access for visibility mode, the public data goes to the protected section of the derived class, as well as the protected data goes to the protected section of the derived class. And next is the visibility mode is private. When I don't say anything, when I don't specify any visibility mode, the default visibility mode is private. When I say private, private data never gets inherited. Whatever may be the visibility mode, private data never gets inherited. The public data goes to the private section of the derived class and protected data goes to the private section of the derived class. So next, it does not get inherited and it cannot be accessed outside the class. Like when the visibility mode is private, the public and protected data goes to the private section of the derived class and private data never gets inherited. You please see this. It is a very important question. In the table also you can have a look, and in this thing also you can have a look. So what it is saying, the public data, if the type of inheritance is public, public will go to public. If the type of inheritance is protected, public will go to protected. And if the type of inheritance is private, public will go to the private section of the derived class. Protected will go to protected in the case of public inheritance. Protected goes to protected in the case of protected inheritance, and protected goes to private in case of private inheritance, and private data is not accessible whatever the visibility mode may be. Next is single inheritance. This is the general syntax of single inheritance. Normally they will ask you to write a program for single inheritance. It's a commonly asked question to write a program for single inheritance. You can either go through your lab program or there are many example programs in your book. What is a single inheritance? If a derived class can have single base class, that is, there is only one derived class and one base class, that type of inheritance is called single inheritance. It's the most simplest form of inheritance, that is because you have one derived class and one base class. That is why it's the simplest form of inheritance. A derived class with single inheritance can be declared as. So you have one derived class and one base class. It is the most simplest form of inheritance. A derived class with single inheritance can be declared as. First you should have a base class, then only you can. If you don't have a base class, you cannot create a class from that. So class, base class is not a keyword here. Class is a keyword. You can give any name to your base class, and since this is the general syntax, we are writing it as base class only. Class, base class, inside that you will have the private, protected and public data, and then a class has to be terminated by a semicolon. After that, I do have my derived class. How do I write it? Class again is the keyword over here. Derived class is the keyword over here. Derived class name. Derived class name can be any user defined name. And then I will have a colon. You can write either visibility mode here, or you can say private or public or protected, whichever you want. Single inheritance, yeah, any type of inheritance, you can have any whatever visibility mode you want to have. Like I told you, like what happens if the visibility mode is private, if it is protected, and if it is public. So here in the example they have written as public, then base class. So class, derived class name, colon, visibility mode, base class name, and then the data of the derived class, because not only inheriting, the derived class will have its own data. So semicolon, terminated by a semicolon. The class needs to be terminated by a semicolon. This is single inheritance, and normally they'll ask you what is single inheritance and explain it with an example, a programming example. They ask you, you can write a very simple program over here, or I have written programs in the class. You can just go through that, you will know. Single inheritance, you have to show this diagram also, and whatever is the program statement here, that was done in the class. Like when I have taken lectures, you can search for inheritance class in the YouTube, you will get this. But then see, one base class, one derived class. This is single inheritance. A single inheritance is just one base class and one derived class. Next is multi-level inheritance. What is multi-level inheritance? Multi-level inheritance is nothing but I'm deriving a class A from I'm deriving a class B from A. So A is the base class, B is the derived class. Then I can derive one more class C from B, where B is the base class, C is the derived class. That is, a class can be derived from the classes that is already derived. Like you have different levels. You have base class A, from that I am deriving B. So B has the base class A, and from the B I am deriving C. So C's base class is B, which is derived class of A. So a derived class can also be a base class. That is, derivation of a class from another derived class is called multi-level inheritance. You have multiple levels over there. You can see here, this is the base class. From that I am deriving first derived class. So what is the base class for derived class 1? Base is the derived base class for derived class 1. From derived class 1, I am deriving one more class called derived class 2. So which is the base class of derived class 2? Derived class 1 is the base class of derived class 2. Like that only you can derive n classes. You can see different levels of inheritance over here. This is multi-level inheritance. Next is this is multiple inheritance. Make a change over here. This is not multi-level. The heading change you can make, but in the statement it is correct only. If a class is derived from more than one base class, it is known as multiple inheritance. One living example is your parent, like a child and parents, wherein they inherit from father also some qualities as well as from the mother also some qualities, and the child has its own. So that is multiple inheritance, wherein you have more than one base class and the base class are not related to one another in any way. So base 1, base 2, base n are different base classes. From all of that, if you are deriving one derived class, like a derived class having more than one base class, is called as multiple inheritance. Please don't get confused between multi-level and multiple. Multi-level is different and multiple inheritance is different. Here I don't have any levels. Only thing is, a derived class is having more than one base class. In the other two, a derived class will have only one base class. In multi-level also, a derived class will have only one base class, which happens to be a derived class from another base class. That's it. But here I can derive a class, means a derived class having more than one base class is known as multiple inheritance. When they ask you all that, please write. You're supposed to draw these box diagrams. Even in the PU board, you need to draw these. Then only you will get marks. When they ask you, you need to write the statement along with the diagram. And for some, they will say, with the programming example, you need to explain it with the program. Otherwise, if they ask you explain any three or any two, then you need to draw these box diagrams and you need to write the statement of it, like what exactly it means. If a class is derived from more than one base class, it is known as multiple inheritance. All these programs I have done in the lecture, you can go through that. Next is hierarchical inheritance. If a number of classes are derived from a single base class, it is called as hierarchical inheritance. Means you have one base class. I am deriving multiple derived classes, not one below the other. See, when I say one below the other, it means multiple inheritance. Like here I have from the, for example, I have a class called shape, I can derive three classes, rectangle, triangle and circle from the shape. All the three share the same base class. Please make a note of this. I made a note of this. See all these diagrams here in hierarchical inheritance. What happens is you have one base class and you derive multiple base derived classes from one base class. Like you have one base class shape and you are deriving three classes from it. These three, the only common thing is they have the same base class, but otherwise they are not related to one another here. So this is hierarchical inheritance. Next is hybrid inheritance, a combination of two or more types of inheritance. That is, if you have more than one type of inheritance in a program, such type of inheritance is called hybrid inheritance. Getting it? If you have more than, see what are the things here? Cricket is the base class. From that, and I am deriving two classes, that is bowler and batsman. So what is this called? This is hierarchical, right? Having one base class and multiple, you are drawing multiple derived classes from there. And then an all-rounder is a class which is having two base classes, that is bowler as well as batsman. From that you are drawing. So it is a multiple inheritance. You have hierarchical and multiple inheritance here. So more than, it is not compulsory that you should have hierarchical and multiple only. Any two types or more you have in one, then that kind is called as hybrid inheritance, a combination of two or more types of inheritance in a program is called hybrid inheritance. Please make a note of this. So we did practical program also, we had done. Please go through that. For single inheritance, they ask for single inheritance, they definitely ask you to write a program for that. Please go through that. And virtual base classes. What is a virtual base class? Like, see, in multiple inheritance, if you inherit multiple copies of the same, when two or more objects are derived from a common base class, we can prevent multiple copies of the base class being present in an object derived from those objects by declaring the base class as virtual. Getting it? Like, for example, I have class A. From that, I derive class B and class C. So, class B will have properties of class A as well as class C will have properties of class A. Then I derive a class D through multiple inheritance from B and C. So, D will get copies of A from B also and copies of A from C also. So, there will be more than one copy, right? It gives rise to ambiguity. That is why we declare it as a virtual base class, so that it will only one copy gets inherited. That is, you have a class A, from there you derive a class B and you derive a class C. So these two are the derived classes of A. And then through multiple inheritance, I will derive a class D. So the class D will have copies of A from B as well as from C. So it will have multiple copies of the same thing. That gives rise to ambiguity. So that is why I will make A as virtual. So when I derive it, class B virtual public A and class C virtual public A. So C is also from A and B is also from A. Then when I derive a class D from B and C, I get only one copy of A. That is virtual base class. So this is the inheritance chapter revision. We have come to the end of the inheritance chapter revision, and I think I'm exceeding my time. So I'll not be able to do pointers. What you can do is, you can Ask your campus teachers for important questions or the important topics which you need to refer there, and you go back to the pointers chapter in the YouTube, you will be able to understand it. Do well in your exams. All the best. Take care. And these chapters are very important even for your board exam point of view. Take care. All the best. See you on Monday. Bye bye.